You've probably seen it, even if you don't know what it is. We're talking about an invasive plant that covers trees and fences called kudzu.
Kudzu can grow more than a foot every day and can be very difficult to kill off.
Kudzu has always been the kind of problem that's easy to joke about and hard to defeat. It drapes over pines and power lines, swallows abandoned barns, and turns whole hillsides into a single shaggy green wave. For decades, it has stood in Alabama as both a symbol of the South's stubborn beauty and a reminder that some well-intended ideas can tip into ecological chaos. So the moment Alabama committed to a coordinated effort to get rid of kudzu at scale felt like a pivot in the story of the state's landscape, a decision that turned an old punchline into a serious public priority. Before we start, hit the like and subscribe buttons for more updates. This statewide push was not born from a sudden burst of botanical outrage. The rationale built slowly from practical pressures that residents and agencies had been feeling for years. Road crews repeatedly cleared shoulders only to find the vine reasserting itself within the same warm season. Utility workers battled to keep lines accessible. Landowners watched fence rows disappear behind curtains of leaves. In forests, young trees struggled under the weight of a plant that grows so fast it makes ordinary maintenance feel like bailing water with a teacup. In the background, budgets bent under 1,000 small costs that never quite made headlines, but never quite went away. What made the shift feel decisive was how the state framed kudzu as both an ecological invader and an infrastructure risk. Instead of seeing vine-covered rights-of-way as merely unsightly, planners treated them as vulnerable points where safety, inspection schedules, and emergency access were compromised. Highway interchanges, rail corridors, and major power routes became early priority zones, not because they were the only places that mattered, but because they symbolized how deeply the vine had entwined itself with daily life. The project began to look less like beautification and more like resilience planning. The strategy had to admit a blunt truth about kudzu. Part of its legend comes from the way people fight it. Short bursts of clearing satisfy the eye for a moment, but leave deep roots untouched. A credible statewide effort implies multi-year plans that expect regrowth and treat it not as failure, but as an anticipated phase of weakening the plant. Timing becomes central because the vine's seasonal rhythm determines when it is most vulnerable. This kind of patience is unglamorous, but it is the difference between storytelling and stewardship. In practice, a serious campaign would blend mechanical removal, targeted grazing, and carefully controlled herbicide use. Mechanical clearing is often essential for reclaiming access and reducing immediate biomass, especially in thick stands where other techniques cannot even reach the base of the vine. Managed grazing by goats can repeatedly defoliate kudzu on slopes or in sensitive areas, functioning like living mowers that reach places machines struggle to handle. Chemical treatment, when used responsibly, can target the plant's long-term survival by weakening root systems rather than just trimming the surface. A statewide plan also depends on cooperation with private landowners. Kudzu does not respect property lines. If one parcel is treated and the neighboring acreage is left untouched, the vine can creep back like water seeping through a crack in a dam. That reality forces policy to become social as well as biological. Cost-sharing options, simplified reporting for new outbreaks, and accessible technical guidance are not administrative extras. They are the backbone of any attempt to control a plant whose success rests on persistence and proximity. Education becomes another pillar. Kudzu is woven into Southern storytelling, and Alabama is no exception. Many people grew up hearing about vines swallowing cars or creeping across backyards like slow green lava. A smart campaign would not dismiss that folklore. It would harness it. When the public already has a vivid mental picture of the threat, the job of education becomes guiding that energy toward participation rather than resignation. The cultural familiarity of kudzu can be turned into motivation, a shared understanding that this is not an abstract environmental issue, but a daily, visible one. The messaging also needs realism. Promising to remove every last vine in one sweeping season invites disappointment. A more credible approach defines priority zones, critical corridors, and phased objectives. the implication of this communication style is deeper than public relations. It acknowledges that ecological repair is a long game and that patience is a form of strategic intelligence. When citizens understand the timeline, they are more likely to remain engaged and to judge progress by sustained change rather than instant transformation. From an ecological perspective, the implications of aggressively targeting kudzu are profound. Kudzu is a light thief. By climbing and blanketing trees and shrubs, it blocks photosynthesis, weakens native plants, and can turn diverse edge habitats into green monocultures. Reducing its dominance creates space for native vines, understory shrubs, and saplings to regain a foothold. That recovery can trigger a broader rebound because more diverse plants support more diverse insects, which then support birds, reptiles, and small mammals that depend on layered, varied habitats. Biodiversity is not just a moral or aesthetic goal, it is a resilience strategy. A landscape dominated by one aggressive species is more vulnerable to sudden shock. Drought, storms, or disease can hit a simplified ecosystem like a hammer. Encouraging a mosaic of native species spreads risk across many different tolerances and life histories. In that sense, Alabama's commitment to kudzu control implies an investment in the state's capacity to absorb environmental stressors that may intensify as summers grow hotter and rainfall becomes less predictable. Soils and water systems sit quietly beneath the headline. Kudzu's dense mats can change how rainwater interacts with the ground and how leaf litter accumulates and decomposes. In some places, the vine suppresses understory plants that stabilize soil. In others, it alters nutrient cycling by dominating the biomass that returns to the earth. A carefully managed reduction of kudzu, paired with protection or reintroduction of native ground cover, implies healthier hydrology and more stable soils over time. The goal is not to pretend a single vine explains every erosion or runoff problem, but to acknowledge that removing a major disruptor gives natural systems room to recalibrate. Wildfire considerations add another dimension. Thick vine growth can contribute to heavy fuel loads, especially where it climbs into trees and forms ladder fuels that allow flames to move upward and spread more rapidly. Clearing kudzu from strategic corridors may reduce the intensity of localized fires and improve access for suppression crews. Even the possibility of such risk reduction matters in a region where a single dry, windy stretch can turn ordinary brush into a dangerous blaze. Invasive plant management, in this frame, becomes part of public safety planning. The economic implications are equally significant. Kudzu's habit of overwhelming roadsides and utilities translates into maintenance costs that are often scattered across budgets and therefore easy to underestimate. A statewide program shifts spending from reactive, emergency-style clearing into planned, preventive management. This kind of fiscal clarity matters beyond the environment. It demonstrates how tackling a chronic problem can be a rational financial choice, not just a feel-good gesture. When a state decides to fight kudzu systematically, it is also deciding to stop paying the same bill over and over with no long-term savings. Forestry would likely be one of the most direct beneficiaries. Alabama's timber industry is a cornerstone of many rural economies. Young plantations and regenerating hardwood stands can be vulnerable to vine competition, and kudzu's ability to smother trees can slow growth and reduce yield quality. Embedding kudzu control within broader forest health planning implies protection not just of trees, but of jobs, local tax bases, and the long-term stability of communities that depend on managed forests. Environmental stewardship and economic defense become the same effort. Agriculture gains in quieter but meaningful ways. Kudzu often invades fence lines, field margins, and neglected corners that become reservoirs for future spread. It tangles with fencing, complicates livestock movement, and steals usable edge space from farms already pressured by weather volatility and market uncertainty. State support for control implies recognition that farm viability depends on many small reductions in friction. Removing an invasive plant from the list of daily headaches can improve efficiency and reduce the feeling that landowners are fighting an endless, solitary war. Tourism and identity sit on the edge of the conversation. Alabama's forests, backroads, and historic sites are an asset, but Kudzu can hide scenic vistas and overtake structures that carry local memory. A commitment to control the vine implies a desire to reveal the state's natural variety rather than let one species become the default visual language of the outdoors. This does not mean erasing wildness or turning nature into a manicured exhibit. It means allowing a more authentic, regionally native wildness to reappear, with seasonal changes and a richer palette of life. Public health enters indirectly. Dense vegetation near roads and residential areas can harbor ticks and other vectors, and heavy vine cover can reduce visibility around pedestrian routes and intersections. Kudzu is not a disease organism, but the environments it creates can shape safety conditions and human-wildlife contact. Clearing the vine from key community spaces implies modest improvements in sightlines, access, and the everyday usability of shared places. These benefits may be subtle, but they compound across neighborhoods and years. The cultural implications may be the most revealing. Kudzu's history is a lesson in unintended consequences. It was promoted for erosion control and, as a forage plant, celebrated for its vigor before its costs became undeniable. A modern statewide campaign to remove it implies a public willingness to correct historical ecological mistakes rather than normalize them. That posture matters. It signals that Alabama is not content to let legacy problems become permanent backdrops. It reframes stewardship as a living responsibility rather than a nostalgic slogan. This attitude can spill into other policy arenas. When a state takes an invasive species seriously, it builds institutional habits that can be reused. Agencies learn how to share data, coordinate budgets, align messaging, and develop meaningful metrics. These governance skills matter because the next threat may not be a vine. It might be an insect that attacks forests, an aquatic plant that chokes waterways, or a pathogen that spreads through wildlife. The Kudzu campaign implies a rehearsal for future ecological challenges, a test of whether the state can treat slow crises with disciplined focus. Technology would be a quiet driver of this shift. Mapping infestations encourages remote sensing, standardized field surveys, and citizen reporting tools. Even if the public never sees the full data infrastructure, the state's ability to monitor ecosystem change improves. Information collected to locate and track Kudzu can help detect other invasive clusters or identify broader vegetation shifts tied to land use. In this way, one vine becomes the reason to modernize how Alabama watches over its natural resources. Equity deserves attention too. Kudzu often thrives in overlooked spaces, abandoned lots, underfunded, rural corridors and private holdings where owners may not have the time or money for prolonged control work. A statewide program that offers support to these areas implies recognition that environmental burdens are unevenly distributed. It suggests the state is not leaving the fight solely to whoever can afford years of treatment. When ecological repair is shared, the benefits of cleaner, safer, more diverse landscapes are shared as well. One of the strongest implications is the recognition that removal cannot be separated from restoration. Taking Kudzu out of a landscape without planning for what replaces it risks creating a vacuum that other invasive species can quickly fill. A thoughtful statewide approach implies monitoring and, where appropriate, encouragement of native recovery through planting, seeding, or protective management. This is a more mature form of environmental action. It treats the land not as a battlefield emptied of enemies, but as a living system that needs guidance back toward balance. The title's sense of surprise can be understood not as a promise of sensational follow-on drama, but as a reflection of how surprising the decision itself would feel to people who have lived beside the vine for decades. The real shock is that a problem so normalized could be elevated to a coordinated mission. The implications of that elevation are already expansive. Stronger ecosystems, smarter infrastructure management, more resilient forestry and agriculture, improved data systems, and a renewed sense that long-standing environmental burdens are not untouchable. Kudzu's grip on imagination has always been about scale. It is a plant that makes time visible, showing how quickly nature can respond to opportunity when humans open the door. Alabama's decision to remove it at scale implies that human systems can also respond with coordination when the will exists. The vine represents runaway growth. The campaign represents deliberate restraint. The event becomes a symbolic contest between negligence and stewardship, with the meaning of that contest written into policy priorities, public habits, and the everyday choices of landowners. There's another layer to this decision that sits beneath the visible vines and the practical arguments, and that's the way it reshapes how Alabama thinks about responsibility for shared land. Kudzu thrives in the gaps between jurisdictions, in the seams of who owns what and who maintains what. A coordinated removal effort implies that the state is willing to treat those seams as a place for collaboration instead of blame. That mindset is a quiet but meaningful evolution, because it challenges the old pattern where invasive plants are everybody's problem in theory and somebody else's problem in practice. The policy logic behind a statewide commitment also hints at a long overdue shift from reactive nuisance control toward preventative ecological governance. That's an important distinction. When the institutional habit changes, it can alter everything from training programs to procurement to how counties plan land use budgets. Even if the public only sees crews working along a highway or a cleared hillside near a community park, the deeper structure is that the state is building a template for early detection and rapid response. Kudzu may be the flagship, but the implication is a sturdier system for future threats that won't be as visually obvious. This kind of effort also forces Alabama to reckon with the difference between appearance and function. Kudzu is dramatic because it's so visible, but a state that commits to tackling it must also confront less photogenic problems that travel in the same ecological lanes: invasive grasses that alter fire behavior, pests that reshape forest composition, or plants that fragment wetland edges. The real implication isn't just that Alabama targets a famous vine, it's that it sets a precedent about what kinds of slow-moving environmental risks merit serious attention even when they don't arrive as a sudden disaster. There's a social psychology to invasive species control that rarely gets addressed directly. A plant like kudzu can create a kind of learned helplessness. When you see it everywhere, you start to assume everywhere is the way it must be. The state choosing to fight it at scale implies a push against that resignation. It can change how younger residents see their relationship to place. Instead of inheriting a landscape where invasion feels inevitable, they may inherit the idea that landscapes are negotiable, that stewardship is an active practice and not just a sentimental identity. The educational implications might be more powerful than they first appear. A statewide initiative can feed into school programs, agricultural extensions, and community workshops that frame kudzu as a case study in ecological cause and effect. This isn't just about teaching what an invasive species is, it's about teaching how decisions echo across decades, how systems respond to pressure, and how communities can organize around long-term goals. That kind of civic science literacy has value well beyond the vine, especially in a world where environmental decision-making will increasingly shape economic and public health outcomes. A large-scale removal decision also invites more consistent standards for what responsible land care looks like. When guidelines are clear, landowners who already want to act gain a roadmap, and those unsure of what to do gain a default path that reduces uncertainty. The implication is a more coherent culture of land management across urban, suburban, and rural contexts. Kudzu thrives where the human plan for land gets fuzzy. A rigorous statewide approach implies a tightening of that plan, not in a controlling way, but in a coordinated way that gives neglected spaces fewer opportunities to become seedbeds of return. There's also an understated design implication for public spaces. If Alabama takes kudzu control seriously, it may influence how new roadsides, greenways, and stormwater corridors are planted and maintained. The choice to remove an aggressive invader can go hand in hand with a new emphasis on durable native species that resist reinvasion and require less long-term intervention. That implies the possibility of landscapes that are both more beautiful and more economical to maintain. The vine's removal becomes a catalyst for better vegetation design choices rather than a one-off clean-out that leaves the same vulnerabilities in place. This decision also changes the narrative of rural pride. Kudzu has often been used as shorthand for southern excess, the wildness that cannot be tamed, the humorous resignation to nature's unstoppable will. A serious statewide push implies a different story, not that the South is defined by what overtakes it, but by how it protects what it values. That matters in the realm of identity because environmental stories are also stories about competence, care, and the future a place imagines for itself. Another implication is how this kind of campaign could influence the relationship between residents and scientific guidance. Invasive management is one of those areas where folklore, anecdote, and hard ecology all mingle. A state-driven effort can normalize the idea that evidence-based practice is not an outsider's voice talking over community experience, but a partner to it. When a familiar local problem is addressed with consistent technique and shared knowledge, public trust in environmental expertise can grow. That trust becomes transferable, which is crucial when other complex issues require the same blend of community will and technical clarity. The economic ripple effects would likely include a subtle expansion of specialized local labor. A prolonged, structured initiative implies ongoing demand for trained crews, equipment operators, habitat restoration specialists, and possibly grazing managers in areas suited to that approach. Even without focusing on any later outcomes, the implication of the decision itself is that Alabama is investing in a niche but meaningful segment of green-collar work. That's not just about jobs in the abstract, it's about building local expertise that stays in the state and can be mobilized for other conservation priorities. There's a governance implication tied to measurement. To justify a coordinated campaign, the state would need ways to define progress that are more sophisticated than countable acres cleared in a single season. Success metrics might include reinfestation rates, priority corridor stability, and the condition of restored sites over time. The implication is a more mature accountability framework for environmental spending. When measurement gets smarter, public conversation gets smarter too. It becomes easier to talk about long-term value rather than short-term optics, which is rare and precious in public policy. Finally, there's the ethical implication of choosing to intervene at scale. Removing Kudzu isn't merely an act of subtraction, it's a choice to favor a broader community of native life over a single dominant invader that once arrived under human encouragement. That decision contains a quiet humility, an admission that earlier generations got part of the story wrong, and that correcting course is worth sustained effort. The deeper meaning is not that Alabama is battling a notorious plant. It's that Alabama is choosing to be an active author of its landscape again, and that choice hints at a future where environmental problems are not just endured, but deliberately, patiently rewritten. If you like this video, please give it a like and subscribe to our channel. Also, could you leave your comments below and tell us? What are your thoughts on Alabama removing Kudzu and the outcome? We want to hear from you. Thank you for watching, and see you next time.